broadband.org. We move now to digital technology and digital literacy in this time of COVID-19. How important is that? We have two speakers who will address us on that point. I want to begin with Jackie Puente. She is the Executive Director of External Affairs for Comcast. Formerly, she operated her own consultancy practice as a strategic advisor to Fortune 100 companies on a wide range of issues, including governmental relations, media, and business development. She will be followed by FCC Commissioner Jeffrey Starks, who says that communications and technology are two of the transformational forces on Earth today to deliver equality and opportunity. Let's listen into both.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jackie Puente, and I'm the Executive Director for External Affairs at Comcast NBC Universal Telemundo. And on behalf of everyone in our company, first and foremost, I want to thank LULAC for their incredible advocacy to uplift our families during this extraordinary time. I especially want to thank Cindy Benavides and the folks in the national office for their work to put this together and to continue to do important advocacy when it's needed most. Whether we're talking about the census or getting folks registered to vote, we really appreciate the hard work that you've done to help keep our families and our communities counted and safe. At Comcast, we've been so busy during this pandemic to make sure that everybody has access to high-speed internet at home, whether they're using it to work from home, whether they're using it for telemedicine and telehealth purposes to stay safe, or whether they're preparing to go back to school in a virtual classroom this fall. We've been working with cities and superintendents across the country, in Sacramento, Chicago, and Philadelphia, and Atlanta, to make sure that all students have the high-speed internet they need to be successful in the classroom this fall and to close that homework gap. We've also been working to make sure that new families to Internet Essentials have 60 days of free internet and access to devices like laptops, tablets, and netbooks for less than $150. We know that all of these things come together to make sure that students can be successful learning from home. I also want to tell you a little bit about what we're doing with our news teams. At Telemundo and NBC News, we're committed to providing information in Spanish and English to help people know about what's happening with the census, to get counted, to register to vote and be smart on the issues, and now more and more to be aware of tropical storms and hurricanes and different ways of staying safe during this time. It's strange that we're not all together this year for the LULAC convention, but I know that our advocacy will continue, and I hope that we'll be together next year, stronger than ever. Again, I want to thank everybody for their work on today's panels, for their work to help keep this community moving forward, and I hope everyone has a wonderful convention. Stay safe.
Thank you so much to the LULAC team for inviting me to speak at your virtual summit today. It is no doubt that these times are uncertain, alarming, even frightening, but one constant remains the same. Our steady march for equity remains strong and has even been renewed over these last few months. The theme for the LULAC Summit this year is all for one and one for all. As a fan of the Three Musketeers myself, I do believe that message is as true today as it was over 170 years ago, that we are all dependent on one another in this long fight for justice, whether we're policymakers, civil rights advocates, industry leaders, academics, or even the modern equivalent of a swordsman. And part of that fight for justice, as you all recognize, must be technology and telecommunications policies that empower our marginalized communities, including Latinx communities across our country. One policy issue that has been number one on my list since the beginning of my commissionership is ensuring that all of our communities have access to affordable and reliable broadband. It is indeed a civil rights issue because it is directly connected to our education, to employment, and the ability to raise a family safely and comfortably. We know that Latinx households are significantly less likely to have a home broadband connection when compared with their white counterparts. I saw this up close when I visited Congressman Ben Ray Lujan in New Mexico last year. And as it relates to education, Latinx student households are unconnected and underconnected. 26% of Latinx students lack adequate access to the internet. And forcing our students to go to parking lots for access is not acceptable. A recent study shows that Latinx students are at a risk of falling over 9 months behind during this pandemic. And one of those reasons is due to the lack of access to broadband, which allows them to complete their work remotely. I recently teamed up with former U.S. Secretary of Education, John King, on an event where we focused solely on the Latinx digital divide. This event featured Congresswoman Torres Small and a panel of advocates who are fighting for digital inclusion, because we all acknowledge that internet inequality doesn't just impact students during those crucial years of K through 12. Lack of access to broadband and the tools needed to navigate this digital world can have an adverse impact on the trajectories of life. And without the expansion of the FCC's E-rate program, I do fear that we will be letting down our Latinx students and their households across the nation, but especially during this pandemic. And we must recognize that this moment is not just about surviving. It's about finding a way to thrive, which means Latinos must be equipped with the digital skills needed to start and grow their businesses. Latinx people, and Latina women in particular, have been starting businesses at a more rapid pace than any other segment of our population. That important fact cannot be overlooked because it contributes to our economic activity in the U.S. And during this digital age, we must ensure that Latinx business owners can fully operate and compete in the way that business is done in the 21st century. Lastly, I must note that our democracy depends on Latinx households being connected to broadband. We need all households to be counted in this year's census. Since this is the first time the census has been largely online, and Latinx communities are historically undercounted, even with a traditional paper census, I fear that they will again be undercounted. There are billions of dollars on the line, and we need to ensure that Latinx communities get the funds they deserve for the next 10 years. Without access to affordable and reliable broadband in our Latinx communities, this country will suffer the consequences economically, socially, and politically. It's not too late to connect Latinx people in rural, urban, suburban America to broadband that they need. But we need bold action, and we need it from Congress, the FCC, and advocates like LULAC to continue and ensure that we're able to create and sustain a nation that's inclusive, equitable, and just. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing about the outcomes of this panel and the remainder of LULAC's virtual summit. Be safe and be well.
I want to thank again Jackie Puente and Commissioner Jeffrey Starks for their messages that they're sharing on the second day of LULAC 2020 Virtual Summit. Let's turn our attention now to Latinos in digital literacy amid technology and, of course, COVID-19. In this age of technology and this pandemic, what happens now? To lead that conversation, we've invited Maurita Corey Flippen. She is a lawyer. She is the president and CEO of the Multicultural Media, Telecom, and Internet Council. Extensive experience as a social impact leader and someone who, as a former media executive and someone who obviously understands the law, can connect with the issues that are so important in this space of technology and communications. Let's turn our attention now to Latinos and digital literacy in the age of technology and COVID-19. Maurita?
Welcome to LULAC's 2020 Virtual Summit. My name is Maurita Coley. I'm President and CEO of the Multicultural Media, Telecom, and Internet Council. I'm very excited to welcome an august panel of experts today to talk about Latinos and digital literacy in the age of technology and COVID-19. As you all know, Black and Brown communities face unique barriers to broadband adoption and often lack the digital literacy skills required to protect themselves from a broad range of harms, including discrimination in employment, data breaches, and loss of control over sensitive personal information. Our panel today will discuss the need for more broadband access and the efforts that are underway now to close the digital literacy gap, specifically among Latinos. And I'd like to go directly to the panel. Our first panelist is Alejandro Roark, Executive Director of Hispanic Technology and Telecommunications Partnerships. Welcome, Alejandro. We also have Amanda Renteria, Chief Executive Officer of Code for America. Welcome, Amanda. We have Daiquiri Ryan, Strategic Legal Advisor and Policy Counsel for the National Hispanic Media Coalition. Welcome, Daiquiri. And last but certainly not least, we have Laura Baracall, Vice President of Policy and External Affairs for Charter Communications. Thank you, welcome you all. This is a small group, small industry, so we all know each other. So I look forward to having important conversation with you today. So let's go right to the questions, and I'd like for each of you, as part of your response, to feel free to include anything about your background, your organization, and specific initiatives that you're involved in. So I'd like to start with, in what ways is your organization working to close the digital literacy gap? And tell us a little bit about what is the digital literacy gap, starting with Alejandro.
Well, hi, Marita. Thank you so much for having us, and thank you for LULAC for facilitating this conversation. As you mentioned, my name is Alejandro Work, and I'm the Executive Director for Hispanic Technology and Telecommunications Partnership. And we're essentially a CEO roundtable of 16 of the country's oldest and largest Latino civil rights organizations who work in coalition to promote access, adoption, and full utilization of technology and telecommunications resources by the Latino community across the United States. So I personally try to work at the intersection of ethics, technology, and public policy to educate, advocate, and serve as a national voice for Latinos in tech and telecom policy. So for us, I think when we think about the digital skills gap, we really try to ensure that, as well as when we talk about the importance of broadband access, that we're also talking about adoption, and we're also talking about digital literacy skills. We know that it's important today in this COVID world to manage your money, credit cards, loans, debts, scams, identity theft, and I think it's particularly kind of important that, as a lot of these safety net resources have been kind of transitioned completely online, it's important that we give everybody, especially like older Latinos, the tools to be able to spot and stop scams and to be able to kind of navigate the new digital world. So I just think that that's something that we kind of really work to ensure that we work in coalition to ensure that, both the country's leading internet service providers not only connect, Latino Americans in every part of the country, but also I think are helping us to ensure that there are kind of digital literacy training so that we all know how to survive and thrive online.
All right, thank you. I'd like to go now to Amanda Renteria. Tell us a little bit about what Code for America is doing with respect to digital literacy.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. LULAC, I love these forums. And it's always a pleasure to be with everyone that tunes into all the great work that LULAC is doing. So as mentioned, I am Amanda Renteria, and I'm probably a little bit different on this panel because most of my history in my career has actually been in public service. And it's a little unusual that I'm actually now in tech, given that I grew up in one of the lowest income congressional districts in the state of California, but really one of the 10th lowest income across the country. And it was only about 5 years ago that my old high school ensured that every single kid had access to a computer. And so it gives you a sense of really where my thought process comes from as to why I think Latinos need to be engaged in technology. We can't wait for 5 years ago before all of our kids have technology. To give you a sense of Code for America, what we do, we often talk about the two biggest levers to change people's lives at scale is government and technology. And what we do is we put them together. The way we put them together is we actually sit with government leaders, public servants who are actually delivering services like food stamps, like earned income tax credit, and we do the back end. So you might have heard of one of the best food stamp programs is Get Cal Fresh in California, where we have about 90% eligible uptake. What we do is that back end. And the reason why I mention it on this call is because there's an idea that the community needs to learn digital literacy. There's also that tech needs to understand our community. And so the way we have actually built our products is to sit down with our communities and say, okay, ahora qué tienes que hacer? What do you need to do in order to get a food stamps? Or what do you need to do to have to apply for earned income tax credit? And so my view of digital literacy is not just that a community that I grew up in, we need to make sure that everyone has access to computers, but we also need to understand that as we are building tools that government is supposed to reach out to communities, that we are doing it in a way that government and the systems that government uses see the community itself and serve them in their language, in their way. And so as Code for America looks at what's happening in COVID, we ended up being the very first organization that has a true free mobile app to do your taxes and to get stimulus, not only in English, pero también en Español. And I think that for me and for what I'm so proud of at Code for America is we've got to meet them, both of them, the community getting access, and then tech companies, cable companies, et cetera, meeting the community where they are as well.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear that, Amanda. And I'd love to hear more about how you're working on the EITC tax program, because I know that's a great program, and the refunds often provide the first savings that, you know, some of us are able to, to have for the whole year. I'd like to go now to Laura Baracall of Charter. Tell us a little bit about what Charter is doing with respect to bridging the digital literacy gap.
Yeah, thank you, Marita. And I love the comments that I heard already so far. So good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. Thank you to LULAC for the opportunity, and congratulations, I guess, on your first virtual annual conference. It's a big accomplishment. So my name is Laura Baracall. I work with the Policy and External Affairs team at Charter Communications. And for those maybe that are unfamiliar with my company, we are a connectivity company, and we provide TV, internet, voice, and mobile services under the brand name Spectrum. So we serve 30 million customers across 41 states, and many of the communities that we serve are incredibly diverse. So finding meaningful ways to invest in our communities is really important to us. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic has really tried and tested our communities in really unprecedented ways, and finding ways to work together to ensure communities are connected is really more important than ever. And improving broadband adoption has always been at the top of the list for Charter as it relates to our community impact efforts. One of the ways that we've been working to close the digital literacy gap is through our Spectrum Digital Education Grant Program, which we launched in 2017 to help bridge the digital divide. And through the program, grants are awarded to local community organizations and really supports their efforts to educate communities on the benefits of broadband. And it teaches communities how this technology, can really improve their lives. And there's no better time now than to have these types of programs in place to really make sure communities have the resources and tools that they need. So just as a few examples, going back to what Amanda was saying, the grants that we provide, they're used to provide computers and laptops, to create digital education classes, and even build new technology labs that teach essential digital skills that are so critical right now for upward mobility. So we've actually partnered with LULAC through this program and other partners like Hispanic Federation, Catholic Charities, to ensure that that we're reaching people where they are. So tools and resources are accessible and available. And, the access piece is also incredibly important. And Charter also provides, as many of you are familiar with, our low-cost, high-speed broadband offering, which is called Spectrum Internet Assist. And eligible households across our 41-state footprint can actually subscribe to this service. So, making sure that all our communities have access to broadband, again, is so critical right now. And we really need to make sure that everyone is putting their best foot forward, including the private sector. So, I wanted to at least share some of those updates in terms of what we're doing from the corporate side.
Great. And I like to share, I'm on Charter's External Diversity and Inclusion Council, and I'd like to commend Charter for its newest VP, your newest VP, Laura Baracall. Congratulations. And also on all of the wonderful work that you do with MMTC and the National Urban League. It's an apprenticeship program that we've recently collaborated on in the telecommunications industry. Yeah. And last but not least, definitely not least, is all of the efforts that Charter's been doing in terms of increasing the minimum wage, being a leader, a forerunner in terms of corporations that are focused on increasing the minimum wage. And I'd actually like Daiquiri, if you don't mind, I'd like to just drill down on this whole issue of COVID and how COVID has specifically impacted our communities. It's as if everyone was all of a sudden thrust at home, and then we recognize that not all homes are equal. COVID has highlighted a lot of the inequities and disparities that Black, Indigenous, people of color, and communities are facing in terms of access to broadband, access to health, and other disparities. So I'd like to turn to Daiquiri now and ask, what can we do to ensure that our children, the upcoming generation of Latinos we're focused on today, do not continue to fall behind due to the lack of access and proficiency with broadband? So Dacre, could you talk to us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Marita, for this really important question. And thank you to LULAC for having me today. I'm really excited to be here representing the National Hispanic Media Coalition. For anyone who is not familiar with NHMC, we're a 34-year-old civil rights organization that really focuses on two buckets. One would be expanding and protecting digital rights for the Latinx communities. A lot of that is what we're talking about today. And then we also focus, in Hollywood on increasing representation both in front of and behind the camera of Latinx people. And so, this question is really something that's been on our hearts and minds for the last few months, right? This pandemic has devastated our community. We know all of the stats, right? We know that Latinx are more likely to be hospitalized and to die from COVID. But beyond that, the pandemic has really kind of pulled back the curtain on how critical access to the internet is in American equity. And so for NHMC, when we look at, how can we start to close the digital divide, it really starts with one simple thing for us. Access to the internet is a human right. We can't live our lives and be economically and upwardly mobile without it. And so, once we can move the needle on that notion, our next step is really thinking about how the government, including Congress and the FCC, should take a step further and enforce the Communications Act and build out universal service to everyone in this country. We did it decades ago, or almost a century ago, probably with electricity. We did it decades ago with landlines, but we really had to start first with that notion of this is something that's essential, and it's too big of an indicator of equity in our country to ignore it. And so, a lot of people will argue with me that that's a moonshot right now, especially in this political climate. And I'll leave that debate for another day. But the good news is we really can do some work while we wait for that, right? We can bolster programs like Lifeline and other, federal and local programs that are run by anchor institutions. And we have to really take this moment to support those kinds of things in our community so that we can continue connecting people while we kind of solve the larger issue.
Thank you, Dacre. And speaking of that, why don't we go to Alejandro at this point and talk to us about what are some of the things that are going on to ensure that Latinos are connected, that that the students don't fall behind because of having to go home. And also, if you could spotlight some of the programs. There was a Keep Americans Connected program that a number of the broadband companies supported and didn't turn people off during a certain period. A number of companies have extended it beyond that period, offered free hotspots, and did a lot of other things to try to help Americans to stay connected during this pandemic. But now those programs are, coming to their end, and I know there's some other things that you, Alejandro, and others are working on. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the things that you're working on at HTTP to make sure that Latinos do not fall behind during this pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll kind of echo a lot of what kind of Dacre said. As structural inequalities and working and living conditions have been paired with underlying health disparities, continue to drive higher infection rates and death rates for people of color nationwide, broadband access has really revealed itself to be an important social determinant of community health that has proven to not only reduce the risk of unnecessary exposure and infection, but also helps to correct the unequal effects of the economic shutdown, right? So I think when I think about kind of like getting back to school, mitigating, compounding risk factors for the Latino community, I think it's important that we have both short-term and long-term strategies, right? I think that you mentioned the FCC pledge. And I think that, as we consider, the country's largest internet service providers, they really kind of have stepped up in this time of critical need and crisis, and said, we're here to ensure that all Americans get connected, that they're able to access, that they're able to learn from home, to work from home. I think all of that we've seen, they've really kind of stepped up their leadership in that regard. And I think that what has happened is that a lot of these pledges have been informal kind of like structures and voluntary structures, right? And I think as we really start to think about how to build a more resilient and accessible kind of like internet broadband infrastructure, right? It's important that we really think about, you know, what is the best way to really stretch the American taxpayer dollar, right? There's a lot of pressing needs that every household has. And I think that it's important for us to have smart solutions that really kind of like can get people connected today, especially as we think about going back to school, which is going to start in about 2-3 weeks. Some students are already back in school. And so I think to be specific about some of the things that the strategies that I think we really have been supporting is this idea of like an emergency broadband benefit, right? So we know that in the HEROES Act, the House leadership passed and included some kind of really great kind of broadband benefits. But, you know, unfortunately, the Senate hasn't really taken action on any specific kind of broadband infrastructure or stimulus initiatives. And like I said, you know, from the perspective of the Latino community and our coalitions at HCTP, we really want to make sure that we are supporting and leading initiatives that have, you know, bipartisan support, that there is, you know, industry consensus, that civil society also is at the table and has a hand and a voice in shaping that. And we really think that kind of like right now, something that we can all do is support this idea of including an emergency broadband benefit for every American across the country, which would look a lot like a stimulus benefit, right? The people would be able to kind of use that to either connect for the first time to at-home broadband or to use it to offset the cost of either their at-home broadband, or we know that the Lifeline program helps people pay for their wireless bills. And I feel like that's a really important kind of short-term stopgap measure, but I think that we also need congressional action and more specific kind of like robust public-private partnerships to ensure that there's also long-term strategies and that we're minimizing, I think, the regulatory burden of deploying a broadband infrastructure to Latino communities across the country, specifically those living in kind of rural communities.
Thank you, Alejandro. And you brought that to our attention, the emergency broadband benefit, and MMTC did sign on to that. We think that would be a wonderful opportunity to support people who really need support, you know, after the Keep Americans Connected pledge is over. And we also have supported another voucher that would apply to home broadband or to help people pay their smartphone bills or hotspot bills. So we're with you all the way on that. And Amanda, I would love to know, because I said I know everyone, but I actually don't know Code for America quite as well. So could you tell us a little bit about what Code for America is doing in the same regard with respect to ensuring that Latinos don't fall behind with respect to broadband access during the pandemic?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that we have done and have done just as a matter of who Code for America is over time. One is we really believe in tech talent, and not just bringing in tech talent into government, but making sure to bring them into the organization. So Code for America has an apprenticeship program and a fellowships program. And the idea is we want people with lived experience to come in and bridge tech skills as well. And so part of what we believe is important is that we have leaders in the tech space that are able to bridge that gap to communities as well. But I want to say there are a couple of ways that we believe it's even more important, our social safety net is even more important today, because we are seeing Latinos are affected by unemployment. We see more folks falling into needing things like food stamps, needing cash assistance. And our programs as they exist right now in government are not actually set up well to reach into communities that are different, that are hard to reach. And that kind of work is imperative. And I'll talk about two different things that we have done. As we look at redoing our systems, we start with the premise that some of these systems are inequitable to begin with. So how do we use technology to take the harms out of the processes and the systems in order to actually work? Good example of this, food stamps. When people used to apply for food stamps, it wasn't just 5 years ago, you used to have to go to a desktop, not even a mobile, a desktop. Oh, and by the way, it times out after 30 minutes. So if you have any problem reading a complicated form, and by the time you're done and ready to hit complete, yeah, it goes away. Those kinds of frustrations are a real message to the community that you're not welcomed here, and just legitimately they can't get through it because we don't have systems that actually understand where they come from. Now, what can we do and what have we learned in COVID? Over the last 4 months, we've had a real opportunity across the country, really, where policies we have been pushing for a very long time on a temporary basis got pulled down so they can get services out to people. A very good example of this is school lunch programs. All of a sudden, people weren't going to school, so what do? We had to get out what's called pandemic EBT cards. In order to do that, you need the back-end technology to be able to find where those communities are. And so our number one thing that we are doing right now that we think is going to help all communities, but especially the communities that we have been seeing that are using our food stamps programs, that we were the back-end technology for the Disaster Relief Act for immigrants here in California, that if we can continue to talk with them and make these temporary policies that were brought down, if we can make them permanent, we know that on a long-term basis, we can actually get to scale and make sure that not only can people get access to government in terms of cash assistance and food stamps, but also the economic opportunity that's going to come back when we see these jobs and economic recovery happen.
Wonderful. And thank you so much for sharing with me some of the things that you're doing, especially with the EBT cards, because I didn't realize that was even occurring. So thank you very much. And Laura, on this same issue, what from the corporate standpoint, what kinds of things is Charter doing in order to make sure that Latinos stay connected and literate, digitally literate during the pandemic?
Yeah, thank you. You know, in today's COVID environment, I feel like connectivity is fueling a revolution in many ways, and how we work, where we're working from. So if you're not connected online, you are at a significant disadvantage. And we get that. So even throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, Charter has really worked to do its part to help ease the strain on so many Americans. You know, through our efforts, we connected nearly 450,000 students and teachers and their families to high-speed broadband service at no cost for 60 days. You know, that's a big commitment to making sure that folks are getting served. And in addition, we kept approximately 700,000 customers connected when they had a hard time paying bills because of economic hardship due to COVID. So, you know, we know folks are struggling, and we all need to find ways to make sure that we're moving the needle. We want to be able to support our communities, and we want to be able to support our employees. And now we're looking at back to school. You know, I have 3 kids, and I'm just like, what are we gonna do? We're going back to school. This is crazy. You know, and they're not going back to school. That's the problem. So, you know, we have a Spectrum enterprise business working directly with school districts across our footprint, so our 41 state footprint, through what we call a Stay Connected K-12 program. So this is to assist them in offering high-speed broadband access to students, educators, and staff in their homes. So that connectivity is going directly to their homes. So the way the partnership works is the partnership gives schools and districts the flexibility to add students to the program when needed, and it helps to bridge the digital divide by providing much needed in-home connectivity, which is what we need to see, especially as we kind of go into this remote learning environment for, I don't even know, indefinitely, right? So this is another critical step that we're taking to get more households connected as we gear up for the new school year. And, you know, one other point that I'll raise, because I know we're talking about the upcoming generation of Latinos, and that's, you know, our kids now, we also need to think about rural areas as well, right? I feel like, you know, we focus a lot on what's going on here, but 85% of the 20 million Americans that are on the wrong side of the digital divide live in rural areas. So the question of, you know, why is this so is an important one. So our industry is asking the Federal Communications Commission's, the FCC, to review this issue, to clarify fair rules that will help speed up deployment and reduce costs so we can actually reach more people. You know, companies like ours, we want to expand to more rural areas. We want to reach more unserved communities, but we really need the FCC to act, and even Congress to kind of move things forward and make sure that we have an environment that works for us as well. Yeah, I mean, and I hope that in this discussion, Marita, that we can talk a little bit about those specific areas, especially around rural broadband, because it's, we tend to kind of forget that, right? So I just
Right.
wanted to raise it
Well,
here.
let's take that to the next question then. So the question is, what are some of the unique vulnerabilities that Latinos face online? But I think what I'd like to do is, given that you've raised the rural broadband issue, because I think there is the myth that that there aren't any Latinos or people of color in rural areas, when in fact, that's not the case. So I'm going to open this up to anyone. What are some of the unique vulnerabilities that Latinos face online, or getting access to online? You can talk about privacy, you can talk about, whichever ones of those most affect you. So why don't we start with Amanda? What are some of the unique vulnerabilities that you're aware of that Latinos face online, and what protections are there in place to assist with that?
So two different thoughts about this. One, thank you for saying rural. I grew up in rural America, and that's exactly some of the factors that these communities face, which is there is no broadband. People forget about it. They move past it, even in a state like California. So I appreciate that. I think part of the issue that we are coming into as the Latino community is we need to start to be able to count where we are, see us. And part of what I'm really concerned about is in this idea of rural and in this idea of we're moving to a new place of digital and technology, we've got to be able, legislators, policymakers have to be able to actually count what it looks like. Part of the reason why my old high school, just got access to digital is because they never really done a count, and then all of a sudden sent that up to the state and said, wait a second, X% of our kids are actually don't have access to broadband, don't have access to digital. And so I can't stress enough how many decisions, not only right now, but in the past, have been based on data and how we are showing up to policymakers when you start to say, where do we need to provide services? Where do we need the programs? So that's one real reason that we've got to push forward and make sure the census actually does count everybody. But the second piece that I'll say is for us, and this is sort of reflective of the Latino community, we've got to have high expectations for what our kids need and deserve, especially as you start to think of the Latino community as the largest group in a lot of different states, the largest majority of public school kids right now in kindergarten and first grade. And if we are not fighting like heck to make sure that people see us or people are counted, even if we don't end up on that census, guess what? Programs don't follow that. And so I say that the challenge there is really speaking within the Latino community and saying, we've got to be fighting for our kids to get what they need. And today that comes through technology.
Right. Thank you. And Alejandro, would you like to?
Yeah, of course. So I would say completely agree with that. The census is so important. People can take it on mobile, right? So it's accessible, but also I think we have, LULAC has amazing programs. Another HTTP member organization, Hispanic Federation, actually has a dial-in line. So if you have just a phone, call them. There's a phone number, HispanicFederation.com. They have all the information. They'll help you fill out your census, which is so important. So I would say 100% as everything is kind of moving online. And I love that we're talking about younger generations of Latinos and the rural-urban digital divide. But I think it's also important to kind of acknowledge that, the average age of Latinos across the country is about 27, right? So we've really grown up as digital natives, and according to kind of Nielsen's latest report, are more likely to use technology than other segments of the population, right? And so I think that, US Latino consumers are embracing technology faster than any other consumer segment. And we're online using search engines, devices, apps, connecting to peers and family through social media, participating in the digital economy at rates that continue to outpace other consumer groups. But at the same time, we're also creating a lot of sensitive consumer data that is not only being weaponized against us, but it really is, our shopping habits about what coffee shop we go to are now being used to determine our credit worthiness, whether we can qualify for an immigration visa, determining the cost of our car insurance. So I think that those are unique vulnerabilities that us as kind of like young millennial Latinos face, is that we're so kind of digitally connected and we don't, today have a national standard to protect consumer privacy so that regardless of where you live or what device you're using or how you're connected to the internet, there's a set standard that kind of brings all of the players within the tech ecosystem together to center, consumer protections and to ensure that we all have some type of a recourse to say, that this is our data and it shouldn't be used for ways that we didn't consent to. So that's just another thing that I would kind of flag, and a unique vulnerability that I think Latinos are definitely at risk for.
Right, and I'd also, since we're talking about the census, just want to make sure that we mention that there's the misconception that there's a citizenship question on the census. It does not exist. And also you can do your census. I did mine on my smartphone in like 5 minutes. So so thanks very much for raising the issue of the census. And then Laura, would you like to, we also raised some other issues dealing with privacy. Can you give us a little update on what's going on in terms of privacy legislation to protect consumers?
Yeah, well, protecting the privacy and personal data of our subscribers as such a huge company is one of our most important responsibilities as a broadband provider. So we've consistently called for comprehensive federal privacy legislation that empowers consumers. I mean, I think at the end of the day, consumers should have a clear understanding of how their personal information is being used online, and they should feel confident that their information is being protected. So at Charter, we have these kind of 5 core principles that's become a privacy mantra, I guess, at the company, and they include control, transparency, parity, uniformity, and our 5th one is security. So, 5 different areas that are really important because they kind of touch on all pieces of the equation here for privacy legislation. And we support the adoption of federal legislation that is based on those kind of 5 privacy principles, which we believe should really be applied across the entire online ecosystem. All companies essentially should be held to the same standard, regardless of whether a service is free or paid. I think what we're looking for is a framework that allows all companies to have a clear understanding of what the rules of the road are. And when we don't have that, what we end up seeing is states kind of making their own rules of the road for their given state, right? So then you have consumer confusion because if you're in one state, the rules and the laws are as one way, and then you go to another state and it's different. So you don't have clarity in terms of how your information is being protected. So I think that's really an important piece that we need to look at to make sure that once we have that nailed down in terms of companies knowing what the rules are, all of us, then we can kind of move forward and make sure that consumers feel good about and feel confident working with us and subscribing to our services, at least.
And while we're on the subject of civil rights, we have renowned civil rights attorney Daiquiri Ryan, and National Hispanic Media Coalition has been known for protecting civil rights of Latinos for many, many years. And with so many things having migrated to online platforms, Daiquiri, do you want to talk a little bit about how we can protect civil rights online, given the current environment? We still have a lot of the same kind of issues with housing, with voting, with health, with economic justice, so can you talk a little bit about our civil rights online and how they're being protected or challenged?
Absolutely. And thank you for this question, Marita. You're absolutely right. This is something NHMC is really, working on the forefront of. And so the short answer is, nearly all civil rights have some sort of online aspect these days. But the long answer, really mirrors NHMC's story. When we started 34 years ago, when we first kind of broke into this tech and civil rights field, we were fighting hate over cable airwaves, right? And in some ways, we're still doing that. But largely, the majority of our work, including fighting hate, working for access, equity, racial justice, all of that has moved online. And so, we were talking a little bit about some of the challenges Latinos face online. And so we know that we over-index as smartphone users, right? That's typically how we access the internet. And so it makes so much sense then that Latinos love social media. But do you know who else loves social media? Organized hate. And so we have seen just an inexcusable rise in anti-Latinx hate speech online since 2016. And it's no coincidence that the FBI reports a steady increase each year since 2016 in hate crimes against Latinos. And so that's why NHMC is one of the founding organizations of Change the Terms. And it's also why we're one of the leading organizations, along with LULAC, in the Stop Hate for Profit Facebook boycott campaign. And so we really feel like the platforms and our government really need to do more to be able to protect us online. There's so many different layers to this, whether it's, the AI and the bias within the algorithms that are affecting our opportunities that we see, but also just simple enforcement of saying, we're not going to accept hate. We're not going to allow marginalized communities to be discriminated against and harassed.
Great. I want to give, I'm getting a time notification. So does anyone else want to answer that question? If not, I'm going to go on to another question. Yes, Amanda.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I love that you're bringing this conversation forward. And I think one action item for everybody who is watching is, as we start to look at proposals or data or what people are doing, ask for, what does this mean for the Latino community?
Yes.
Any proposal you see come across, having worked at the California Department of Justice, what helps is to have the data. And so make sure that as we're thinking about policies or proposals, or you're asking questions about what companies are doing, ask for the sub-data. What does this mean for this community or that community? That's what allows on the back end to be able to come in and change things.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. So let's talk about that. We were talking about the hate speech and the civil rights of Latinos in particular being violated. A lot of the things that are going on online just seem just sort of unimaginable, 5 years ago. And now we see just the, plethora of hate speech, of, fake news, and just all kinds of things that are going on. And obviously it's not something that Latinos can do on their own, or that any group can be on their own. So what I'd like to ask the panelists to think about is, how can we use allies? The word now seems to be allies in terms of helping to come to an agreement as to what kinds of standards and how everyone is going to be treated online. How can we use allyship, or how has your organization used allyships in order to make sure that Latino communities are protected online? Does anyone want to take that first?
Well, I mean, I can just say from my end, you can't dismiss the value and power of public-private partnerships and community partnerships. I think there's just so many opportunities to develop different programmatic initiatives that really help to kind of address a range of issues, including, what we're discussing now in terms of online safety, and just making sure that folks have the information they need to better understand how to, navigate the internet. I for one, my parents, they don't get online. It's like, I have bought them a computer. I have set my mom up with a Gmail account. It's just, I think that there's some individuals that it may not happen, and maybe they're a little, older, but I think, there are huge opportunities to make sure we're leveraging partnerships to make sure that we're doing more. And I'd also say that thinking outside of the box, thinking creatively in terms of how to empower and revitalize communities is important too. And I'll just mention quickly, our company, we have a community investment loan fund where we work and we invest in community development financial institutions. They lend to small businesses in underserved communities. And they're able to kind of make sure that they're providing different types of services as well. So, I just think, when we're thinking of allyship, it extends across the board to so many different areas, and we should all be thinking about creative ways to kind of leverage those opportunities.
Great. Anyone else want to share any experiences with allyship?
Yeah, you know what, I would say that, I have I think the benefit of having worked at LULAC with Cindy, with Brent, with President Domingo. So I think that I have, throughout the course of my professional kind of like experience there, I definitely learned to appreciate the value of the LULAC network nationwide, right? I want to lift up the fact that, like, you know, Charter has those community access grants that they're easy to apply for online. That really empowers communities to design solutions that are community focused, right? Charter's not going to say, this is what you have to do. They're saying, you know what, help us innovate, right? We want your strategic mindset. We want you as community leaders to contribute to kind of help solve the digital like connectivity problem. And we also have, you know, like other partners like AT&T that has a similar kind of like sub-funding grants available to kind of help promote kind of like their low access, their low cost digital service. So I just think that, you know, as LULAC, as LULACers across the country who really are community leaders across the country, I think it's important that we stay connected, right? That we all continue to kind of work collaboratively. And I think that my goal at HTTP is for all of us to get to the point where when we hear about tech and telecom policy issues, when we hear about consumer privacy, we understand that that's a uniquely Latino issue, that our lives are impacted by it. And not only that, but I think that given the moment that we're all living, we all have the ability to shape not only the present, but the future. So I would say that, you know, something that we can all do today in our household is to just start tuning in, right? HTTP has a lot of resources online if you want to learn about these issues. We have webinars that we do. We have our own kind of civil rights principles that we have for establishing a federal framework to protect consumer privacy. So I just think it's really up to us to continue to kind of raise those issues in our communities and in our households, to just ensure that, you know, we are actively contributing and holding, you know, everybody in the tech ecosystem accountable for ensuring that there are Latino perspectives at the table and that our lives and perspectives and our needs are met, and that they're not, you know, unintentionally reinforcing, you know, deeply embedded pre-existing kind of like racial biases. So that's kind of like my soapbox moment, but I know that like the LULAC community is all about that. And I just feel like we need strong advocates to really tune in. And I know that, you know, as soon as we all get to that point where we realize how important it is to, you know, the economic well-being of the Latino community, then we'll all start to show up. So
that's great. And I think one of the greatest examples of allyship is public-private partnerships, like the one in Chicago with Mary Lori Lightfoot has pulled together Comcast, RCN, United Way, and a number of other organizations to pay for home broadband for hundreds of thousands of students that don't have broadband at home. So we've got the 2-minute mark. Please, want to start with Laura, give us a closing statement in about 40 seconds.
Might do it a little faster.
Okay.
No, I mean, I think this is a great conversation to have. I'm very happy to have been invited to be part of it. You know, I think this time right now is it's so hard. And I, you know, as a parent, I just couldn't relate to so many people because you're working from home, you have kids, you know, you're trying to manage so many things. And, you know, I think just making sure that some boxes can be checked, like internet connectivity in my home check, you know, understanding how to manage my kids' remote learning check, you know, those things will be very helpful moving forward as we continue to kind of live through this, you know, very unique time in our lives. So thank you for the conversation and thank you for the invitation.
Okay, Daiquiri, closing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a great conversation. I think, you know, we're just kind of getting started. I wish we had another full hour to chat about these things, but you know, at NHMC, as we kind of move into this next phase of the pandemic and recovery, we're trying really to think about long-term solutions and how to kind of interweave the fight that we're fighting right now with civil rights for the Latinx community into this, you know, larger movement that we're seeing. And it's up to us to be allies and to say, you know, this affects us too, and let's work together.
Great. Amanda?
I'll start where I'll end where I started, which was the two biggest levers to change is government and technology. And everyone on this call, you have a chance to be a part of really redefining what technology means in the future, especially now that we're all digital forward. And then the second is government. Vote, be engaged, know your policies, and speak up.
Great, thank you. And Alejandro,
I mean, I already had my soapbox
you
moment.
already had yours. Okay.
So I would just say, like, come be a tech nerd with us. Subscribe to the HTTP newsletter, httppolicy.org. Let's be friends, and I'm happy to be a resource anytime.
Great, thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you, LULAC. LULAC is a treasure. Cindy, all of you all, thank you so much. And we hope that we'll see you at the next panel, which I'm sure we'll all meet up again soon. Thank you so much, everyone.
Congrats to LULAC on the virtual summit.
Congratulations, LULAC.
Hi, I'm Corey Anthony, Senior Vice President, Chief Diversity and Development Officer at AT&T. At AT&T, we know that the diverse voices in our teams ensure we perform at our best. And it is that same diversity that makes our country unique and strong. We are feeling the residuals of that history right now as we fight a pandemic that is disproportionately impacting the health and economic security of Latinos. If there was ever a time to work together, it is now, and we are ready to do the work.
I'm ready to write some code.
I'm ready to do what no one on my block has done before.
Forget that. What no one in the world has done before.
All I need is access, tools,
Connections.
high-speed connections.
Is the world ready for me?
Since 2011, Internet Essentials from Comcast has connected millions of people from low-income homes to the internet, so they can be ready for anything.